G'day and welcome to Queensland Farmer. Well, we're back on the farm today. We've got Cameron Leckie here, who is a Regional Soil Coordinator from the University of Southern Queensland, who has come back out here to the farm to have a look at our soil. So perhaps, Cameron, you could explain what you're out here doing today.
Sure, thanks Chris. So we were out here a couple of months ago where we took some soil cores and sent them off to the lab to get the data. We've now got that data back. We're going to grab a couple of cores, we'll have a look at them and we'll have a look at the soil data and see what we can learn.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, let's get into it.
So today we're going to collect two soil cores. The first one's coming in the slope. So you can see we're sort of halfway, or what we call mid-slope, between the top of the slope and down the bottom of the slope there where there's a natural sort of water flow line. So we're going to take a core here, and I'd expect that'll be a different soil type to what we see down in the sort of, as we head down to get some flatter country near that copse of trees. We'll take a second soil core and see, we've got some test results to compare and we'll see what difference we see in the soils. We're in a different part of the landscape now, so we were up on the mid slope, we're now down in quite a flat area, and as it continues down this flow line, it ends up in a creek line. The soil formation processes are quite different between the two locations, so we'll expect that the soils themselves will be quite different. And the reason we selected this spot is because it was inundated at the time and had been inundated for quite a period of time. It's still pretty wet, which we'll have a look at shortly, and we'll pull a soil core out and see what it looks like. Okay, so we've got two soil cores we've taken. The soil's still in the tubes basically. We need to get them out, so I'm just going to pick them up, put them in the trays, and then we'll be able to have a sticky beak at them. Let's see how easy they come out. Pretty easy. And now this one. So they look quite different, and we'll go through it shortly, but want to guess which one's which?
I think the one closest to you is the one down where it was wet.
And that would be correct. So this is the slope, and that's down on that flow line heading towards the creek. And I guess immediately you can see how much moisture is in the topsoil. As you can see, that's free moisture there, which isn't evident as we go further down, although this will still be quite moist. So we took the two samples out of the paddock. Same paddock, different parts of the landscape. We've then, as you saw previously, taken them out of the tubes, and now we have them so we can have a decent look at them. And not surprisingly, given the different locations in the landscape, we've actually got two very different soils. So you might want to zoom in and have a bit of a look. And I guess the things that you can see immediately that stand out to me when you're looking at the soils is the difference in colour. So there's a distinct difference in colour. and that is as a result of different soil formation processes that have taken place. You can see this soil core, the one which is taken in the flow line, is quite greyish and dullish, and that's largely because it would have been formed in a low oxygen environment. So low oxygen means the whole soil chemistry has changed, and you quite often see those grey dullish colours in soils that have been formed in saturated conditions or regularly saturated conditions. What's of particular interest is it was very, very wet up the top here. The sort of moisture's dried off a bit, but it's actually saturated in the top. When you get down to the bottom, it's not what I'd say dry, but it's certainly much drier than what was occurring in the topsoil. So in comparison, the soil taken on the slope, we have a distinct change between the topsoil and the subsoil. So in the topsoil, you can see how it's a darker colour. It's that nice dark brown colour that we see in the soil. And it also looks much more granular or coarse. Okay, so this is probably some sort of loam, and when you feel it in your fingers, you can feel little bits of gravel, like large particles of sand. And then we move down into the subsoil, and you can see how it sticks together as a nice big solid rod. That's an indicator of clay. So we could texture it by hand, but we won't do that right at the moment. But what we have here is what we call a texture contrast soil. So you have an increase in the amount of clay in the subsoil compared to the topsoil. One of the first things I look at when I'm looking at the soil core is how far do the roots go down, because that's an important indicator as to how productive your plants are going to be, will be on how far the roots go down, because that's where they access obviously water and nutrients. If we look in the topsoil, you can see there's in this soil on the slope, you can see there's quite a lot of roots in the topsoil, and that continues down. You can see plentiful roots, not large, but there's plentiful roots. You can also see just in this part here, which haven't broken off, you can see there's roots going right down through there, and it might be hard to pick up on the video, but there's some very fine root hairs down here to about the 60 centimetre depth, but not a lot, but there is root hairs. In contrast, we still have reasonable amount of root hairs in this soil down to about the 25-30 centimetre mark. But as we get down low in the soil profile, so now looking at about 60 centimetres or thereabouts, really can't see any root hairs at all. So that probably indicates some sort of chemical constraint that makes it inhospitable for the roots to actually get down that far. This is part of the soil from the subsoil on the slope, and there's a few fine root hairs that you can see. It might be difficult to pick up on the footage, but there's actually some different colours in the soil, so it's not a consistent colour, and that's because we have what's called mottling, or reduction oxidation reactions, which occur when the soil water table raises up and down, and you have periods when it's saturated and unsaturated, and you get accumulations of materials such as iron, which form these what we call mottles. So that's an indication that drainage is imperfect, and there's periods of time when this has been inundated and then or saturated, and then drying out. One of the things I often look at is aggregate stability, how the soil holds together under the force of water. So there's a simple test that anyone can do. All you require is a little bit of rainwater or deionised water. You don't want to use bore water or town water because it's got salts in it. You put that in a dish, and then you put a little bit of soil in. So if you zoom in here, Chris, I've got two samples, one from the topsoil and one from the subsoil from the flowline sample. This was taken out of the top of your dam where there's a little bit of erosion occurring. So that's that sample in the middle. And then this is topsoil and subsoil for the sample we took on the slope. And what we can see is evidence of what we might call dispersion. So you can see in this sample here, we've got three little parts of soil, and they've fallen apart, and you can see it's quite cloudy or quite milky where the clay particles have fallen apart. That's what we call dispersion, and it's probably an indicator of having lots of sodium in the soil. That's not a good thing because the soil sort of, I guess you could describe it like the soil's melting, whereas we want the soil to hold together. Interestingly, we're in the same core, but as depth, there's nowhere near. There's a tiny little bit of dispersion in this one of the three samples we took, but the others have stayed together quite well. So that indicates a lower level of dispersion in the subsoil. The sample from the dam, we can see one's got a reasonable amount of dispersion, one's got none, and one's got the tiniest amount around the edges. So potentially that's why that erosion issue is there, because the subsoil is actually dispersive. And I guess if it's not addressed, it will continue to get worse over time. The soil taken on the slope, however, we can see there's no evidence of dispersion. The soil's fallen apart somewhat, what we call slaking, but it hasn't dispersed into the individual clay particles. So that's a good thing. Ideally, the soil will all hold together, and it pretty well has for a couple of these samples. It's fallen apart somewhat, because the more organic matter, the roots, fungi, all the glues that the roots exude are holding that soil together, the more stable the aggregates will be. Whereas if there's not enough root action, not enough organic matter, you see the soil fall apart, but not like when it falls into its individual clay particles with the dispersion. So this is good. This is not great, but not terrible, but this is a bit of a problem. I'm now going to do a pH test. So I'm just using a pH test kit which you can get from any hardware store that you use in your garden. It's not as accurate as a lab test, but a lot cheaper. So I'm just going to put some of the liquid on, and then I'll follow that with the white powder. Soil pH is probably the most important chemical property of a soil, so it can be acidic, neutral or alkaline. And when it's at extremes, so strongly acid or strongly alkaline, that's when you can have problems with like nutrient availability, water uptake, etc. So we've done a pH test at 3 different depths. We've got a little card here which we can tell. So in the topsoil there, you can probably say it's probably around pH of 6, close to that, which is fine. Anything above 5.5 is good. Maybe a little bit higher, slightly higher. These are only roughly accurate, so it's not 100%, but it gives you a guide. So once again, we've got an acid soil here. But interesting, as we get down into the subsoil, you can see there's little bits of sort of green, but it's probably almost, a neutrally coloured. So we're probably looking at a soil that's either neutral or slightly alkaline in the subsoil. But nothing to worry about. That's all pretty good. But what it shows is that the pH of the soil changes with depth. And what can happen is you get a chemical constraint, which means the roots aren't going to grow to a certain depth if you have either a strongly acid or strongly alkaline soil. Okay, if we look at the second core, so the core taken on a slope, once again we can see it's acid, probably not quite as acid in this area here, about 20 centimetres down as it was as we go further, so the acidity's increased a little bit. Same again with depth. So we're still looking though, maybe in the subsoil, we're maybe getting to the point where acidity is starting to be a concern. And that might be an indicator of why there's not a lot of root action occurring down at depth. Just here, I've added a little bit of acid, hydrochloric acid, to the soil, just so you can see the difference when you have a strongly acidic soil. And you can see we're getting reds and oranges, which looks like we're in a very low pH. And certainly if you had a soil with a pH like that, you wouldn't find anything growing in it because it's pretty inhospitable. So Chris, when we were here last time, we took some samples, sent them to the lab, and we used a depth of 0 to 20 centimetres, and that's because we also did biological testing, and that was looking, we wanted to have the same depth for the chemical testing as well as the biological testing, but if you're doing it just for an agronomic reason, you'd probably do a 0 to 10 centimetre increment, maybe 10 to 30 if you're going to do some subsoil. But yeah, so we got results from 0 to 20 centimetres, and they tell us a number of things. So I guess the first thing is we got the organic carbon numbers. So in the sloping position, we had a number of 1.6% organic carbon, which is a rating of moderate, and then 1.8 in that flow line. So a little bit higher, and it's actually different classifications for how much carbon, so a bit high. So moderate to high, that's looking pretty good, particularly in this loamy material here, where there's not as much clay. So it's got that organic matter, which is feeding the roots, feeding the plants, feeding the microbes, so you're getting that productivity. So it's good to see some reasonable levels of organic carbon. The second important figure other than the carbon, the next thing I'll sort of look at just to get an idea of the inherent fertility of the soil is what's called the cation exchange capacity. So we've got a dinner table here and we can fit 8 seats around it. So if we think of this dinner table as the cation exchange capacity of the soil, we can put 8 cations or our plant nutrients around this table. If we had a bigger table, we might be able to get 20, 30, 40, and that would be a highly fertile soil, more seats at the table. Or if you had a smaller table, you'd have less ability to hold those nutrients. So what we've got here was 7.5 cation exchange capacity on the hill slope and 5 down in the flow line. So that indicates sort of a reasonably low level of inherent fertility. That is the ability to hold nutrients such as calcium, magnesium and potassium. There isn't a lot you can do about that. The only real way you have to increase your cation exchange capacity, because it's an inherent property of the soil, is to increase your organic matter. But the actual inherent property of the soil is what it is. So you just need to understand that when it comes to management, and that might dictate how, if you're going to do a fertiliser regime, how often you put fertiliser on the soil and how much you need as well. We've talked about the inherent fertility, so your organic carbon levels and cation exchange. And next, look at constraints, so particularly chemical constraints being pH, how much acid or alkalinity there is, and then as well as salinity. So with the pH, both acid, but in the top 20 centimetres, but not a concern. So around the 6 mark is fine, but it's one of those things you might want to monitor over time, because the more acid your soil gets, the more lime is required to address the acidity. But at the moment, you've got nothing to worry about as far as acidity goes. Okay, the next thing we're looking at salinity. There's no low levels of salinity, so nothing to worry about here. So that's not going to have any influence on your plant growth. There was acidicity identified in the flow line. So it was classified as sodic. So it's a sort of large percentage of sodium on that cation exchange, which I mentioned previously, and that aligns with this dispersion that we found here. So that makes sense. But this you can do for free, whereas the lab test you actually have to pay for. But the numbers align there. And then this was found in the topsoil here, was found to be non-sodic, which also aligns here. We just said no evidence of dispersion. Okay, so I guess if you do have a dispersion issue, generally the way to address that is through the addition of gypsum. So gypsum displaces the sodium on that cation exchange component, and then it leaches down through into the subsoil and deeper. And the calcium is a flocculant. It basically brings all your clay particles together, builds your soil structure, which makes it easier for your roots to get penetrate, water to infiltrate. So gypsum and the calcium in it is the solution there. So on that cation exchange complex, calcium and magnesium are sort of two of the major cations that we have there. If you have too much magnesium compared to calcium, you can have soil structural issues. And on the slope, there's more calcium than there was magnesium, so nothing to worry about. So in the flow line, it's what we call magnesic. So there's more magnesium than calcium on your cation exchange. So you can address that by adding gypsum to increase, or potentially even lime in this instance because it's acid, to increase the amount of calcium relative to magnesium. Whether it's worth doing from an economic perspective and a productivity perspective is probably, I probably wouldn't recommend it, just given the location in the landscape and what you're going to get out of adding it. Mm-hmm. So soil test results also look at your fertility, so your major plant nutrients and micronutrients. We won't go through all those, but nitrogen levels came up quite low, so there was or less than sort of detection limit for nitrate, which is one form of nitrogen, and low levels of ammonium, which is not surprising in a low input pasture system where most of the nitrogen comes from what we call the mineralisation of organic matter. So the breakdown of the organic matter is what's providing the nitrogen that the plants require, which is what you'd expect in a low input pasture system. As long as you've got reasonable levels of organic matter, which as the soil organic carbon results showed, then you've got nothing to worry about. So phosphorus is another important nutrient. And we got the phosphorus buffering index measured as well as the actual phosphorus using the Colwell method. And what that indicated is there's actually quite low phosphorus levels in the paddock. So you can create a fertility index based on your actual value plus what the phosphorus buffering index tells. And it was down about 25% at both sites. So that indicates that probably phosphorus is the major limiting nutrient in your paddocks. So obviously you can add phosphorus-based fertilisers or products, organic type products such as chicken manure that have phosphorus if you wanted to raise those phosphorus. So the purpose of what the soil testing we did here is just to see if we can identify anything that the soil test results tell us about what's happening to the soil when it's inundated. So chemically we didn't really find any pointers to suggest that there's a chemical issue created by the inundation. Which we also have to compare their different soils, so that they'll have fundamentally some different characteristics anyway. But there's nothing really there that that was highlighted. The soil biology tests equally, there was some minor differences in that, but whether they were due to the inundation or not was nothing conclusive. But what was interesting, I guess probably the biggest differences was as we went from the top of the slope right down to the lowest position. There was a clear increase in the amount of microbial biomass, and that's not surprising because we got more moisture. So the soil biology has got more moisture in which to grow and expand. And the other thing was that they're true anaerobes, so the microbes that live in no or low oxygen condition, they were almost twice as high in the inundated soil as they were in the soil that hadn't been inundated, but they weren't at levels that you consider to be a concern. So if you do get soil tested, you get lots of numbers back, and interpreting what those numbers mean can be a challenge. So there's a couple of good little guides, like this is a farmer-friendly guide which is available on the net, and describes what all these numbers mean and what levels you're looking for. And if you want to get a bit more scientific, you've got books such as this by the CSIRO, which go into more scientific detail. So I work at the Southern Queensland, Northern New South Wales Innovation Hub. That's funded by the Commonwealth Government's Future Drought Fund, and the aim is to get communities and landholders, farmers, better prepared for drought, and then when drought occurs to help them improve management through drought, and then hopefully a speedier recovery. My role specifically is about helping the implementation of the National Soil Strategy. Australia's soils are on the whole in poor condition and deteriorating, so we need to turn that around for a whole host of economic, environmental reasons, and also to increase the productivity of farm businesses. I'm also a registered soil practitioner, so that's a new accreditation scheme aiming to increase the quality of soil data that we collect, as well as provide enhancements in how we interpret that data to result in better decision making for farmers.
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks for coming out today. It's a really interesting lesson on how soils work. Certainly I've been a farmer that hasn't really had a lot of exposure to the importance of having good soils, but after some time today and the last time that Cameron was here, I've learned an awful lot. And if you'd like to learn some more, I'm going to have some links down below in the description, not only to some of the things that Cameron has spoken about today, but also Cameron's contact details. So feel free to reach out to him, and hopefully he'll also be able to give you some advice on how to make our soils better and also improve the soils that we have. So if you like this sort of content and you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. And if you've got some questions, I'd be very happy for you to put them down in the comments section, and if I'm not able to answer them, I'll see if I can get Cameron to answer them for us. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.